Several years ago, top-down in the round sweaters became really popular, and the appeal was pretty obvious. You could try the sweater on as you go. At the end, you don't need to sew up any seams. You could just block the sweater, weave in the ends, and be ready to go. With all these advantages, you might wonder, why would anybody ever bother to seam a sweater again? But there are some huge advantages to sewing seams in your sweaters, even if it's just in a few places. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, as well as the actual seaming of my sweater sleeves. Hi, I'm Pamela from Fibersprite.com, and I help fiber artists understand what they really need to know so they can get down to their real passion, actually working with fiber. So why would you seam a sweater when you don't really have to? Seams lend structure to a sweater. Sweaters are the largest and the heaviest knit garments that we typically wear, and so having some structure will keep it from stretching out. It can keep it from twisting and biasing and feeling kind of uncomfortable when you're wearing it. Another benefit that I really like about seaming is that it lets you work in smaller pieces. When I'm working on a sweater, it gets big and it gets bulky and it gets hard to turn, and it's just kind of frustrating. But if you're working with smaller pieces, you can stop before it gets to that big, heavy, bulky stage, seam everything together at a later date when you don't have to be lugging around this huge mass of yarn. The most common stitch that is used in seaming sweaters is called mattress stitch, and it just joins the ladders in between stitches from one piece to the next. And depending on where in your garment you are, this can be more or less straightforward. You might also find yourself seaming together two cast-on edges or a cast-on edge to a straight up and down edge. These are all sort of the things that kind of scare people away from seaming, in my opinion, but it's really a lot simpler than it looks. And we're gonna start today by tackling what people tend to consider the hardest thing, which is setting in a sleeve. So come on and I'll show you how. To seam your knits, you're going to, of course, need the pieces that you're ready to seam. This is a sleeve that's ready to be set into the armhole of my sweater. You're going to need some yarn in a color that will coordinate with your sweater. These stitches, for the most part, are going to disappear, but if you stretch the piece of knitting at the seam really hard, the stitches will sort of show. So you want something that's going to be really close or the same. Because I have color work that extends all the way around and shifts in color, I have chosen the darkest color, which is going to be at the top. That is the spot that's going to be the most visible, and I'm counting on this blending with these other colors as it goes along and disappearing. You'll see what I mean as we do the stitches. You'll also need a tapestry needle. You can either use one with a bent tip or a straight tip. I tend to like the ones with the bent tip if I can find them. It just helps me scoop up the stitches, but either kind of tapestry needle will do. A pair of scissors, and then not required but very handy are these clover clips. You can find them in the quilting aisle of most craft stores. I have this sort of regular size and the miniature size. Both of these would work on this sweater, which is kind of a heavy worsted weight yarn. And of course, I have a cup of tea with my knitting T-Rex. This is a Moment mug with an easy ergonomic handle. It means that I can spend more time knitting and enjoying working with my hands instead of having sore hands, because it's so ergonomic, it requires less effort to hold. So the first thing that I'm going to do is line up my sleeve to my armhole. I am going to be matching up some critical points. I'm going to find the center of my sleeve. I'm going to find the center of my armhole. Usually this is going to be the shoulder seam, but it depends on your sweater. So just be sure to know how your sweater's set up. And then I'm going to clip those together. Then I'm going to find the bottom of the armhole on the sleeve and on the sweater, bottom and center, and clip those together. You'll notice that I'm working on the outside. Normally when we're working with knits, we work from the outside because as we do the mattress stitch, it curls into the inside, and that's going to give us the best results. This can be a little bit confusing if you're used to sewing because you usually work with the wrong sides facing you and the right sides together. As I go around and clip these edges together, I am being careful to match up where those color transitions are. That's really helping me to get that smooth transition, and that will get me a nice smooth seam. I'm also tucking the ends in towards the inside. I can work with this as it comes to me, but it's a little bit easier if I do it at this step as I'm clipping things together. I'm going to go a few inches in each direction and then go to the other side, mostly just making sure that everything's matching up as I expect it to. I did a lot of math when I was designing the sweater, so I know that there are exactly the right number of stitches to match into the armhole. So things should match up pretty nicely for me as I go around. If things aren't matching up, then I need to kind of take a look and rearrange. This is not matching up the way that I expected it to. The nice thing about knitting is that it is stretchy. So anytime that things aren't matching up, you can kind of fudge it just a little bit. In sewing, this concept is known as ease. Just sort of ease something into a curve. And that might have just been that I didn't find the center quite perfectly because I was more focused on making sure that this is in view for you all. This is on the armhole, the opening of the sweater, that is that steeked edge. So there are some small ends there that are kind of getting in my way, to be honest. But those will all be turned to the inside and then we can weave them in or deal with them in some way. Really taking my time at this stage is going to save me some time at the sewing stage because if I know that I clipped everything together correctly, then I can be pretty sure that as I'm seaming it together, things are going the way that I'm expecting them to. I feel like everything has lined up pretty nicely. Everything's clipped together and I'm ready to start sewing the seams. This seam really does not use a ton of yarn, but I'm going to give myself plenty to work with. I've got maybe about 2 yards here. I can always add in more yarn later if I need to. Basically, I would just drop the stitch on the inside and then start a new piece of yarn and go from the outside. And I do apologize because this is dark yarn and it's a little bit difficult even for me to see. And I've got off camera, I've got lots of lights here to hopefully make it easier for y'all to see, but I'm picking up 2 of the sort of ladders between knit stitches. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave myself a very long tail, about half the length of the yarn that I cut for myself. And I'm going to stitch in one direction until I get to the armpit. And then I'm going to come back around and I'm going to stitch in the opposite direction with that other end of the tail. So that's why I'm leaving that super long tail. And right now I am seaming a vertical edge of knitting to a horizontal edge of knitting. So I'm going to be picking up a whole stitch to those long legs between stitch. And then I want to go to the next set of ladders and then pick up the next stitch. And I find that it's easier to have my arm up in the inside so I can kind of guide things from the inside with my non-dominant hand and then be picking up the stitches or scooping up the in-between stitches with my needle. At this point, I am not pulling my stitches very tight. I'm just getting them started. But after I go 3 or 4 stitches, then I can pull it tight and that's my seam. So that is sitting in nice enough for what I'm looking for. I mentioned earlier that if you do have the ability to block your project before you do the seaming, you're going to have a much easier time because things are going to be a lot easier to see. Because I had a lot of live stitches on some other parts of this garment, I did not block. You want to make sure that you're staying in that same column of stitches all the way around so that you get a nice even seam. You don't want your seam to sort of zigzag. If you're thinking about a sewing machine, you want your seam allowances to be pretty even all the way around, and that's the same for in your knitting. Okay, so at this point, I am away from the horizontal edge and I have gone into a diagonal edge, which I'm going to be treating more or less like a vertical edge in the mattress stitch. I'm going to pick up my next 2 ladder stitches on the armhole edge and then pick up the ladder stitches on the sleeve edge. Go for about 3 stitches, 3 to 5 stitches, depending on how sticky your yarn is, and then pull it tight. You don't want to pull it so tight that the yarn breaks, but you don't want it to be loose. You want those stitches to just sort of integrate into the fabric. And as you can see, that live edge that we were working with and has really turned itself to the inside. So there's that live edge. Those are stitches that those are ends that I'll need to weave in later, but that is essentially what we have turned to the inside. Because these edges are of the sweater that involve some serious shaping for the armholes and the shape of the arms, I'm being very conscious that as I pick up, there might be some increases or decreases that change the angle or which stitch I'm working into. So if I'm always working 2 stitches from the edge, I might have stated earlier that I'm always working in the same column. It's not necessarily always this column of stitches, it's always the column of stitches that is 2 stitches from the edge. So that is also something to be mindful of. Depending on your sweater pattern and how many stitches you've given yourself for a seam allowance, that number might vary. 2 stitches I think is really nice to work with because it doesn't create too much bulk, but it gives you enough to work with. So I'm getting close to the bottom of the armpit. So that next clip there is where I'm going to stop and then go back around to the other direction. This isn't essential, but I like to do it because it lets me make sure that everything's kind of going down towards the armpit instead of things shifting all the way around. So if there are any irregularity in my seaming, usually what this means is that there's like 1 extra stitch or something like that. That's going to end up at the armpit. It's going to get pushed down into the armpit. And if somebody's spending the time to look at your armpit, then they can just buzz off, right? But the reality is that most people aren't going to be looking at your armpits. It's the least noticeable part of the garment, and you can kind of hide any errors there. You'll also see once I pulled that tight, even though this yarn has a significant amount of contrast with these lighter yarns, you really can't see that anymore, which is part of why I chose this color for all of my seams. I took the yarn off of the needle and I'm going to come back around to the top of the shoulder and start working in the opposite direction. I'm working with that long tail that I left, and I'm just going to go and do the same thing working around in the other direction. So I'm checking where I left off. I left off on the body side, so my next stitch I'm going to take is going to be in the sleeve side. If you're finding seams to still be a little bit daunting, one book that I'd really recommend is called Finishing School. It talks about all the different ways that you can work with finishing a garment. And sometimes this starts with how you set up your garment. If you're giving yourself an extra stitch or 2 for your seams, or how you're making those seams, even how you're finishing those seams on the inside. It's a really, really lovely book. I'm going to link to it in the description below. It was really helpful to me when I wasn't sure about seaming sweaters. There were just like a few details that I hadn't found described anywhere, and there weren't any classes near me. So that was a really, really helpful resource. One of the beautiful things about seaming sweaters is that this is actually really easy to undo this stitch because it's just kind of a spiral. So if I decided that, you know what, something's not fitting here, it'd be really easy to just pull it out and the stitches would come out really easily. It wouldn't have damaged your knitting at all. That's another thing that I really like about this mattress stitch. If you are working with a sweater where the armholes or some part of the seam doesn't perfectly match up, that is not cause for concern. You just sort of ease things together. You might skip one ladder here or there, or in whichever direction isn't matching up perfectly, and just sort of arrange things until it does fit. Usually your goal is going to be avoiding any kind of puckering in the fabric, any kind of ruffles, unless it's specifically like a puffed sleeve or something like that. So you do want to kind of evenly distribute that. If there is going to be some kind of difference in that, usually your pattern is going to have some sort of instruction about where that extra puff is going to be. Usually, like for sleeves, for example, it's going to be at the shoulder, at the top of the shoulder. You wouldn't want to have an extra baggy spot at your armpits, for example. Again, I'm getting into that space where there's a little bit of shaping, so I'm making sure that I'm going by the number of stitches away from the edge rather than the specific column, so things can grow out based on the shaping of the garment. This is definitely a spot where I am grateful that I did this as a 3/4 length sleeve sweater instead of a full length sleeve, because I can just reach my hand up and I'm not up to my elbows in sleeve here. Now, the last thing that I need to do before I weave in ends is I just need to send these tails into the inside of the sweater. Just dive right in, and that is seaming the armhole of a sweater. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.